All right, good morning. We are in 2 Corinthians chapter 5. Chapter 6. Finished up chapter 5 last week. As we finished up chapter 5, we noted some things that, of course, Paul has been continually defending himself, excuse me, defending against the false accusations against him and so forth. And he made specific mention of his ministry. What did he call his ministry? You remember? There it is, ministry of reconciliation. And we made mention of what that word means. What does reconciliation mean? To bring back together. Of course, in the context of Paul's ministry, what's being reconciled, or who's being reconciled to whom? Exact. Man's being reconciled to God. And specifically with the Corinthians, Paul had brought them back to God. Now he's trying to bring them back again because they'd started drifting away. And he calls his ministry the ministry of reconciliation. Of course, not just in Corinth, but Paul did a lot of work in various places. And in the as you study his missionary journeys and so forth, that his ministry was bringing people back to God. And he calls it the ministry of reconciliation. Of course, and that was only possible through Christ, and that's mentioned at the very last verse of chapter 5, how Christ was our sin offering, and that's what enables us to be brought back to God. It's sin that causes that separation, and that's why we need to be reconciled, brought back again. And only through Christ is that possible. And we began looking at chapter 6. I think we only got a verse or two in to chapter 6. So I'm just going to begin reading with verse 1. We'll go down to verse 10. 2 Corinthians chapter 6. Let's read verses 1 through 10. We then, as workers together with him, beseech you also that ye receive not the grace of God in vain. For he saith, I have heard thee in a time accepted, and in a day of salvation. In the day of salvation I have succored thee. Behold, now is the accepted time. Behold, now is the day of salvation. Giving no offense in anything, that the ministry be not blamed. But in all things, approving ourselves as the ministers of God, in much patience, in afflictions, in necessities, and distresses, and stripes, and imprisonments, and tumults, and labors, and watchings, and fastings, by pureness, by knowledge, by long suffering, by kindness, by the Holy Ghost, by love unfeigned, by the word of truth, by the power of God, by the armor of righteousness on the right hand and on the left, by honor and dishonor, by evil report and good report, as deceivers and yet true, as unknown and yet well known, as dying and behold we live, as chastened and not killed, as sorrowful yet always rejoicing, as poor yet making many rich, as having nothing and yet possessing all things. All right, we'll pause there and back up to the beginning of the chapter here. We talked about verse 1 last week, but just to remind you, Paul makes reference to working together, partners in labor. In chapter 5, verse 20, he described himself as an ambassador for Christ. Same concept, I think, going on here. Workers together. What's an ambassador? We talked about that last week. An official representative, excuse me, I'll get the word out in a second. An official representative, exactly. And of course, he's a representative, an ambassador for Christ. An official representative, as an apostle he is. So now he says we're workers together with him, the him being Christ, being the Lord, being God. Of course, if you're not working for the Lord, who are you working for? Well, yeah, there's only one other option. And Paul describes himself as workers together with him, with the Lord. And at the end of verse 1 there, we talked about this last week, but I think it's worth mentioning again here briefly. He encourages the brethren to receive not the grace of God, how? In vain. What does it mean to have something in vain? With no purpose. Yeah. It's empty, it's hollow, it has no real meaning, it's vain. Well, receive not the grace of God in a meaningless way. Receive, yes, receive God's grace. They had received God's grace. But how could it be turned? How could God's grace be received, but then in turn it's in vain, it's meaningless, it's worthless? Okay? But they had accepted it. Yeah. What was happening in Corinth? Yeah, there were many false teachers there, and primarily, as Paul's addressing them, teaching them to go back to the old Jewish system. And if Paul, as Paul's described in previous chapters, if Christ has come and established His new covenant, but now you go back to the old system, you're essentially saying, I don't need Christ. That's receiving the grace of God in vain. It's meaningless. It's worthless. Don't be removed, as I made reference last week to Galatians 1, 6 and 7. That kind of reminds me, this text reminds me of that when Paul says, I marvel that you're so soon removed from the gospel to another gospel. But it's a different gospel. It's not the same thing. You're removed to something else. How could you have God's grace? How could you have Christ, the good news, the gospel, but then leave it? Same thing happening here. They're receiving the grace of God in vain. Questions, comments, and we'll get into where we left off here in verse 2. All right, in verse 2, 2 Corinthians 6, verse 2, Paul's quoting from Isaiah. He says, For he saith, I have heard thee in a time accepted, and in the day of salvation I have succored thee, and behold, now is the accepted time, behold, now is the day of salvation. This is a direct quote from Isaiah 49 in verse 8. And I want to go back, let's go back to Isaiah 49 and get a little bit more of this prophecy. He quotes just a portion of it, but I want to go back and get just a little bit more of it and make a bigger application. As Paul, this is not the only time that Paul quotes from this very text. So let's read Isaiah 49, verses 6 through 8. And he said, It is a light thing that thou shouldest be my servant to raise up the tribes of Jacob and to restore the preserved of Israel. I will also give thee a light to the Gentiles, that thou mayest be my salvation unto the end of the earth. Thus saith the Lord, the Redeemer of Israel, and this Holy One, to him whom man despiseth, to him whom the nation abhorreth, to a servant of rulers, kings shall see and arise, princes also shall worship, because the Lord that is faithful, and the Holy One of Israel, and he shall choose thee. Now verse 8, where our quote is from in 2 Corinthians chapter 5. Thus saith the Lord, in an acceptable time have I heard thee, and in a day of salvation have I helped thee, and I will preserve thee, and give thee for a covenant of the people, to establish the earth, to cause to inherit the desolate heritages. Excuse me. So we have a direct quote there, and this prophecy and the salvation described in this prophecy is described as not being limited to the Jews. Especially as and that's one of the reasons I wanted to go back and get verse 6. Isaiah 49, verse 6. Spiritual deliverance is not just for the Jews. And what does that mean? How would the Gentiles and when would the Gentiles be brought in? In Acts. Through the church, and specifically when Cornelius in Acts chapter 10, as Sister Genesis referenced. Spiritual deliverance is through the gospel, through the church. So that is the ultimate fulfillment of this prophecy in Isaiah. And also Paul quotes from that same context in Acts 13, verse 47. It quotes from it again. Paul says that we are in the time of this deliverance. Ultimate, throughout Israelite history, Hebrew history, how many times did God deliver Israel from some type of bondage, some type of burden that was upon them? I haven't counted, but it's over and over again. He does that. He delivers Israel. He delivers the Hebrews from some type of burden. But this prophecy is a burden that is bigger than any of those and more significant than any of those Old Testament deliverances that took place. Because he's talking about deliverance from sin. Ultimately through the gospel. And as I mentioned, he quotes that same text, same context from Isaiah in Isaiah 13:47. He's talking about the gospel system, salvation through Jesus Christ, the good news. And he's saying the same thing here in 2 Corinthians 6 and verse 2. We have deliverance now. We have salvation now. Don't receive the gospel. Don't receive God's grace in vain. You have deliverance now. Don't go back. Don't leave it. Questions, comments? If they listen to the false teachers who had come into Corinth, if they listen to the accusers of Paul, those who were denying his apostleship and so forth, or you could take it to another level, if they continue in their strife that Paul has been addressing through both letters, if they continue in their division that Paul has been describing, well, they would have been receiving the grace of God in vain. They had deliverance, they had Jesus, but now they're leaving what they have in Him. They're leaving the grace available in Christ. Questions, comments? Right. Great. Great point. Encouragement to us to continue, not to give up, to endure, as Paul will describe his great endurance in the future. And it's also a warning about the dangers of if we do quit. And it's interesting when we've seen that concept over and over again, but here it is again. There's a very common teaching out there that says, once you receive God's grace, you can't ever lose it. Then what's Paul talking about? If that's the case, what's Paul talking about? It doesn't make any sense. He's encouraging us to stay in God's will. God's grace is always there for us, but we have the choice whether or not we stay in it. Don't receive it in vain. These are people that had obeyed the gospel. They were Christians. They had salvation, and Paul's saying, don't leave it. Don't give it up. Don't follow these false teachers that are teaching to go back to another system that is no longer in effect. Because we can apply that to us today. Don't go back to something that's no longer in effect or something that's never been in effect. That's a common thing today. People teaching things that were never God's plan. Absolutely. Very serious matter, isn't it? Yeah. It takes effort to be faithful to God. It's intentional. It's not something you do by accident. Being faithful to God is not an accident. It's intentional, an intentional life. Good points. Thank you. Sure, absolutely. Paul, these are people who had God's grace. They've been saved, and they had their sins forgiven. But Paul's encouraging them, don't leave God's grace. You have a choice of whether or not you have that. Absolutely, that's what he's describing here. Absolutely. And another passage associated with that, and directly tied to the same concept of what Paul's describing here, passage comes to mind is Galatians, I think it's 5 verse 4. We believe it is 5 verse 4. Because there was a similar challenge with a problem with the Galatians. They were being tempted, and false teachers had come in and were teaching them to go back to another system that was no longer in effect. And look what Paul said in 5:4. I had the right verse, but I was looking at it cross-eyed apparently. And all right, it says, Galatians 5:4 says, Christ has become of no effect to you. Whosoever are justified by the law, ye are fallen from what? Grace. Now, can you fall from somewhere you never were? You can't do that, can you? So these are people who had God's grace. These are Christians in Galatia, but now they were leaving God's grace, the gospel system, to go back to the old law. And Paul says, you have fallen from grace. They had lost it by their own choice. Not because God changed, not because it was God's fault, but because they chose to leave what God had put in place. Now, then that is a reminder for us to be faithful, be intentional about our service to God. If we obey the gospel, we have salvation today. That doesn't mean we can go about our lives however we want to. That's a commitment to Christ for life. Good questions and comments. What are the questions and comments before we continue here in 2 Corinthians 6? Yeah. Yeah. And glad you brought that up, because that's an illustration that Paul uses multiple times, describing the Christian life as a race of sorts. Finish it. Don't quit. As long as you finish, you still have God's grace. Just don't quit. Stay faithful. What are the questions, comments? A reminder for us, one day our lives on this earth will come to an end. Don't know when that'll be. But it's a reminder for us to, when that day comes, be faithful. And since we don't know what day that is, that means every day be faithful, because every day could be that final day. And he says in verse 3, going back to 2 Corinthians 6 and verse 3, giving no offense in anything, that the ministry of God be not blamed. What does it mean to give offense? Sometimes we use that terminology in a way that's not exactly the way the Bible uses it. Yeah, causing someone to stumble. And by stumble, we mean what? Fall in sin. Yeah. Sometimes we use that, well, you offended me, you hurt my feelings. Okay, that's our language sometimes we use today, but that's not exactly what Paul is describing here. To give no offense means don't cause someone to stumble in sin and fall. Giving no offense. In his ministry, he's striving to give no offense. He don't want to cause anybody to stumble. He was trying to do the opposite. And we mentioned continual action earlier, and that certainly applies to the previous text, and it applies here. Giving no offense is a continual action. All the time, be diligent not to cause somebody to stumble. Live your life in a way that is not causing somebody else to stumble. That our ministry be not blamed. What ministry? Well, the one he's been describing, the ministry of reconciliation that he has been describing. His ministry of bringing people to God. If we're causing people to stumble in sin, that means our ministry is not reconciling people to God. It's doing the opposite. Then this ministry of reconciliation be not blamed. Literally, blemished. The idea is ridicule or disgraced. That this ministry be not disgraced and causing people to ridicule. When a Christian causes another person to stumble in sin, the cause of Christ suffers. Even to the point of the cause of Christ being disgraced and ridiculed. Now, that's a serious thing when you start making applications to ourselves and how our lives impact other people. This is a serious thing. Do we cause others to stumble by the things that we say, by the things that we do? When we start making applications to that, I mean, that's something very serious to consider in our lives. Of course, obviously, the first application that I think of comes to teachers, preachers, elders, leaders who have a responsibility to try and keep people on the right path and get people to heaven. If we are saying or doing and leading the wrong way, okay, that's the big obvious example there. But it's not limited to that, is it? All Christians have a responsibility not to cause people to stumble, not to give offense. Go ahead. Yeah. It's a serious matter. It's something God takes seriously. Now, obviously, of course, that's a big example there of very popular teachings that are simply not found in God's Word, leading people away from God. But even when you bring that down to a personal level, my life, what about our own influence on other people? Yeah. 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 Not necessarily by the things that we're speaking and or sitting down and trying to study, not necessarily limited to that. Yes, including that, obviously, but not limited to that, just by the way that we live and the choices that we make. How does that influence other people? Um, uh, whether our lives and our decisions show a full conviction and dedication to the Lord or a lack thereof. The example Michelle gave there, and that's something that I know affects people with kids a lot, because we want our kids to be involved in various activities, and that's great, that's wonderful. But what about when those activities start conflicting with our involvement in the church and our attendance in Bible classes and worship and so forth? Well, the decisions that we make in regard to that have not only affect us, but have an influence on other people as well. And to our children, absolutely to our children. It indicates what's truly important to our children. Somebody had a question or comment. Concerning that, we need to be proactive in our decision making with regard to how we're going to live and the decisions that we're going to make. What do I mean when I say proactive in that? And rather than deciding when that comes up, make the decision beforehand. I am far from perfect. I fully admit that, but a decision that Rachel and I made a long time ago before our kids started getting involved in sports and other activities and so forth is that when schedules start to conflict with Bible classes and so forth, the decision's already made. We're not going to that sporting activity. And the decision's already made. So it's not, well, what about this week? No, it's not about what about this week. The decision's already made. And that's something we have to do, be proactive about. And yeah, we'll work with coaches and so forth, and we'll also tell them, if you schedule practice, on no hard feelings, you do what you got to do, but if you schedule practice right this time, we won't make it, or we'll have to leave early, or whatever it may be. But the decision's already made. And we have to do that. And that's not limited to to parents with kids involved in activities, that's our own life. That's our lives, and when it comes to other things that we have going on in life as well. But it seems to be more prominent, very prominent, with regard to kids. Questions, comments? Yes. Have some humility, right? We're far from perfect, and we are, although we have, as a whole, we want to dedicate our lives to Christ. We also know that I have flaws, and although we want to help people come to Christ and help people know the truth, we recognize that I'm not perfect either. Good points. Thank you. Other questions, comments? Verse 4. But in all things approving ourselves as ministers of God, in much patience and afflictions and necessities and distresses, and of course the list continues there, but we're going to go step by step through this. In all things approving ourselves, some translations say commending, or we commend ourselves as ministers, as God's ministers, servants. That's what a minister is, a servant. They were to show themselves approved. Notice the contrast here. That the ministry, in verse 3, that the ministry be not blamed. Now we want to show ourselves approved. Great contrast there. Be approved to God rather than being blamable before God. In this ministry of reconciliation, as he described it previously. And now we have a list of things that Paul suffered in his ministry of reconciliation. As he's working, striving to bring people back to God, he starts giving us a list of things that he's suffered in that. In the first in that list there, he says, in much patience. What does that mean? Because we use the term patience a little bit differently today than what Paul is describing here. What does this word patience mean? Long-suffering, enduring, being steadfast, persevering. And in that endurance, in that long suffering, he has an unwavering loyalty, commitment in his purpose. And then it's interesting that he says, in much patience, and then he lists things that show how he's been patient, how he's endured, how he's been long-suffering. Examples of his endurance is what continues here. And notice also the plurals. In afflictions, in necessities, in distresses, and plural after plural happening there. This isn't just one-time things that came up in Paul's life. All these are plural. In afflictions. Some translations say tribulations. The idea is a situation where he's pressed on all sides. From without and within. You think about Paul, was he ever persecuted by people outside the church? Obviously, yes. But as he's writing these letters in Corinth, there was some problems from in the church too, wasn't there? From all sides, Paul is facing some type of hurt, affliction, pressed. Then he says, in necessities. That's an interesting term here. Some translations say in needs. This is compulsions, forcings against one's will. And as I looked into this word, it seems like he's describing a situation where he has a need that is beyond himself. Something that he knows that he cannot overcome on his own effort. He's in a need. He's in a situation where he can't do this by himself. And of course, that could describe a lot of things. in distresses, in a narrow strait, is what's being described. A cramped, tight place. Narrowness. And this is really similar to the afflictions / tribulations that he just mentioned as well. Very similar. Some of these kind of overlap with each other. And then in verse 5, he says, in stripes, in imprisonments. What does stripes mean? Beatings. Literally, the word means blows. Stripes or blows. Was Paul ever beaten? Yeah, he was. One example, how much time we got? But one example, real quick, somebody read for us Acts 16, verse 23. Acts 16, verse 23.
When they had laid many stripes upon them, they cast them into prison, charging the jailer.
Thank you, sir. So there's one example, but there were a number of other examples as well. As Paul received stripes, was beaten as a result of his service to the Lord. People who didn't like his teaching, causing great pain. He'll describe this again and a little bit more specifically when we get a few chapters later, 2 Corinthians 11, verses 24 and 25, how he received 40 stripes, save one. He had 39. They didn't want to, the limit was 40, so they would go 39 just in case they miscounted. So he received that multiple times. And he's describing that for us here. Imprisonments. Was Paul ever imprisoned? He was, wasn't he? Now, interesting though, it's plural. We know that Paul was imprisoned multiple times. However, at the time of this writing, we only know of one. Now, in the future, he'd be in prison again. But at the time he wrote this, we only have recorded one. And that's in Acts 16, from what we just read, connected with what we just read from Acts 16, Paul was imprisoned in Philippi. That's the only one that we know of up to this point in Paul's life when he wrote this. But it's plural. So that leaves a question. Were there other imprisonments that aren't recorded in the Bible? Possibly. Or is it possible that Paul is kind of writing from a big picture, including the other sufferings of some of the other apostles? I think that's possible too. I don't know which one is the answer. But Paul, we know, was imprisoned. One time that we know of up until this point, but it would happen again in the future. And not just in prison, but keep in mind that he's describing not just what he suffered in life, but what he suffered for the cause of Christ. That's important to remember too. Continuing in verse 5, he says, in tumults. What's that mean? It's a tumult. It is a conflict, like a period of unsettledness, a period of instability. I mean, in society, in the community, we're talking about unsettledness, conflict, instability in the community or in society where Paul is. He suffered, and it's plural. Example of that, we won't take the time to read it because we're short on time. But Acts 14, verse 19, this type of situation is described in Lystra. In Acts 18, verses 12 and 13, this is described in Corinth, which is, of course, to whom Paul's writing, the Christians in Corinth, but it happened while Paul was in Corinth, Acts 18. Then also again in Acts 19, you remember that great event. Where was Paul in Acts 19 when there was a great tumult? In Ephesus, a great uproar among the people. This is describing great disorder and great confusion. And not just, yes, in society, but also, remember again, Paul's talking about things that he endured for the cause of Christ. This is an uproar directly affecting Paul and his work for the Lord. And then continuing there, in labors. Severe, intense labor united with trouble is the idea here. As I looked into this word, interesting that it specifically has to do with the weariness and the weariness that one has when one's strength has been pushed and stretched to its very limit. That's the idea here. And keep in mind, Paul's talking about his work for the Lord. And he's been stretched and wearied in his labor to the very limit. The next one is, the King James says, in watchings. Some translations have the word sleeplessness right there. And it literally means, the word used here literally means to chase sleep. To chase sleep. And the word is metaphorically used to describe being watchful, to be alert, to be on guard. This word is used to describe how Christians should be in general, and being on guard against the devil, 1 Peter 5, verse 8. Also, it's used to describe elders, specifically in Acts 20, verse 31. Paul uses it of himself, and we'll get to it in a few chapters, but in 2 Corinthians 11:28, he describes it of himself as he describes his care of the churches. Sleepless, watchings, great concern, and being watchful over the care of the churches. Fastings, the next in the list there. Again, plural, just as these others are. What is it? What is fasting? Yeah, and specifically food. And it can be, fasting could be intentional. And it's described that way multiple times in the Bible. It's described fasting and prayer. For spiritual fasting, giving up food for a period of time for a spiritual purpose, to refocus yourself. But it's not always intentional, not always a choice. Sometimes it's because of a lack of food. We're fasting. And I think that's the context in which Paul's using it here. Not Paul very well, and can't think of a specific mention of it. Perhaps there is, but just offhand, Paul specifically mentioned fasting for a spiritual purpose, but that's not his intent here. He's talking about a lack of food in his work. You think about how Paul journeyed. You ever think he might have had a lack of food as he's traveling? Seems like that's the sort of thing that he's describing here. Verse 6, by pureness, purity, pureness in motive, uprightness in life. That's the whole scope of Paul's life, his purpose, his motive, his intent. And think about that and contrast it with the typical life of someone in Corinth. Corinth was a sinful place. So this life of purity is in direct contrast with a typical life of someone in Corinth. Knowledge. Now, Paul has inspired knowledge. He's inspired of God. In contrast, connect that and contrast it with what Paul began his first letter with, the wisdom of men, philosophy of men, but he has inspired knowledge. And long-suffering, similar to what we talked about earlier, slightly different, but we'll talk about that more next week. Appreciate your thoughts, your comments in the class.